and then I will introduce you. And it's all very casual. Everybody just, you know, just interrupts everybody else and argues if we feel like it and whatever. Okay.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we're live. Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. We're in Canada, and I'm not going to tell you more about where we are because we are visiting a man who spies on spies. And so I'm getting into the feel of this thing by trying to keep things secret. I don't think he cares whether I tell you where he lives, but we're going to pretend that he's underground someplace doing his nefarious work. Okay? This is going to be a thrilling day because I haven't ever talked to a spy before. And he's a freelance spy in the sense that he's not working for the government. He's working, but I'm not even going to tell you who he's working for. Okay. This is Bill Robinson, and I've known Bill for 20 years or more.
Well over 30, I think.
30. All right, good. Good for you. You remember these things. Yesterday, I said 25 years, I guessed, and the woman, it was 38 years. So that's it. Okay, look, I think this is really fun because I don't know many spies, but I admire the profession immensely. I think it's a very wonderful thing to be doing, and especially if you tell all the secrets that you find out. So, hi, how are you, Bill?
Very well, very well. And you?
Good. And my assistant, Adam Wynn, will join us today because Adam has more of a feel for this kind of thing than I probably do. And he spent a little time reading your blog to find out what other things you've been up to that you post. Good. All right, say hi, Adam.
Hello. I'm not an expert on this topic by any means, but I certainly find it very interesting.
Okay, good. Now, I understand that what you do is, Bill, you go and try to find out everything you can about, is it mainly the Canadian spying organizations or is it worldwide? Do you try to spy on spies everywhere or what?
I'm mostly interested in one Canadian spy agency, the Communications Security Establishment, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency, the agency that listens in on communications and breaks into people's computers and that kind of stuff. And it's part of a global organization, you could say, called the Five Eyes, which is the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, who cooperate very closely on signals intelligence and on other kinds of intelligence gathering. So I'm also interested in the Five Eyes connection that the CSE has, but that's really the area I particularly look at. And I wouldn't characterize myself as a spy, but I'm interested in examining what they do.
Well, okay. Well, come on, let's dignify you a little with this title. I think being a spy would be a lot more fun than some of the other things that I do. But on the other hand, I would be a very bad spy because I tell everything I know. And but then maybe you do too. Do they mind what you do? I mean, do they get annoyed that you're finding out their secrets?
I don't get a lot of feedback from them.
Well, they surely must know.
But I think a lot of them visit the blog and follow me on Twitter. And I think it's a double-edged sword for them. They learn things about their own history from me, a lot of them.
Really?
And they do want to be better known, and on one level because they need to recruit people, for example, and they want the Canadian public to support what they're doing, to know what they're doing in the general sense and support it. But on the other hand, of course, the business they do requires a lot of secrecy, and they don't want people revealing that kind of thing. Now, I don't get access to the real secrets of their business, who in particular they're listening to and whose codes they can break and that sort of thing. That doesn't come out in the kinds of things I find in basically going through publicly available information. So there's not a lot of risk to them really from the kinds of things I do, but nonetheless, I push them to be more open. I try to push them to be more open because they could talk a lot more about what they do than they feel comfortable talking about.
Yeah. Have you ever found out something they didn't want you to find out and then let people know about it?
I would say so, yeah. Um, I was talking about their use of metadata long before Edward Snowden came along.
Oh,
Uh, not to denigrate the importance of the information that Snowden released, which was so wide-ranging and detailed, and not a lot of it, I'd say, was surprising to people who study these agencies. But it's of course it's tremendous. There's a tremendous difference between saying this is what they're probably doing, and I have this little bit of evidence which suggests this is what they're doing, and then having a massive collection of documents that proves that's exactly what they're doing. You know, that there's a big difference between those two things.
okay. Now you've gotten into an area where I've already, my imagination's limited. I never quite understood what it was that Snowden found out and blabbed that was such a shock. You use the word metadata, is that what you said? I've heard
Yes.
that term and I don't know what it means. And is that, what was important about what they're doing? What is that metadata analysis?
Well, the metadata is not the content of communications, but the information that describes where that information is going, and who it's going to and from, and what kind of system is being used, what app or so forth. So it's information about those communications. It's and it can be tremendously revealing about who you're in contact with, or what web pages you're looking at on the web, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things we learned from the Snowden revelations in greater detail than we realized before was how much these agencies do rely on metadata for their work, not only partly in order to find the communications that they want to actually listen to, but also just to examine that data itself in order to determine who's talking to whom, and to find out the people that they think are worth looking at in greater detail. And they collect that metadata in vast quantities, really in bulk. Everybody's operations on the internet are essentially, their communications, their web browsing and so on, are essentially sucked into that kind of collection, so that they can try to find the targets they're actually interested in. To be fair, you know, they're not actually interested in average people. I would say you and me, maybe they're slightly interested in what I'm doing because I pay so much attention to them. But even there are legal limits to what they can do. And I think they follow the laws very carefully.
Well, about 30 years ago, there was a big kerfuffle because I think it wasn't this organization that you're talking about, but CSIS. When it was just getting started, I think CSIS isn't that old. And there was a revelation that CSIS was snooping on peace activists. And everybody said, well, Meta Spencer, you're the one that for sure they would be, you're one of the people for sure. And there were people like the president of the physicians group and things like that who got very, very upset about it. And my feeling was, well, sure, go ahead, listen, I don't care. I've never had any sense of even decent privacy. I don't care. And you know, in fact, don't tell me your secrets, but because for sure I will tell everybody everything. So, you know, I just can't keep a secret. And I don't even understand secrecy. But so I don't know why people were upset. What would they do to us if they knew that I was talking to you, which is kind of thing they would find out?
Yeah.
Why should I care?
Well, I'm not someone who works in the field of privacy, so I can only give you a kind of reheated version of the arguments. Um, but there are people who are in a lot more vulnerable position than I'm in or you're in, who in other countries, for example, who really are unable to necessarily communicate all their opinions in a perfectly public way without putting themselves at risk. And there are legitimate reasons why people should have privacy and why they should be able to organize even opposition to a government program and organize that without thinking that the government is actually listening to them while they're doing that. If they're organizing democratic activity and so forth. I should add that I became employed in the Canadian peace movement in 1984 for Operation Dismantle. It was the very same year that, in fact, CSIS came into existence. And when I got the job with Operation Dismantle, they bungled the tap on my phone because I picked up my phone one day and I listened to them actually putting the tap on the phone. That was CSIS. And,
yeah.
At the time they had these crazy ideas. The peace movement was being run by the Russians, and we were all just either active agents of the Soviet Union, or we were unwitting fools being manipulated by the Soviet Union, and they were collecting information and that kind of thing, and it was nonsense. But
well, I understand that if you live in a totalitarian state,
yeah,
the apprehension is justified.
But and it's not just governments too. I mean, there are companies out there collecting data on all these kinds of things now. And so if you want to get a job, the company that's thinking of hiring you will probably go to some of these companies and find out everything that you've ever posted on social media or something like that, or all kinds of other things that they can get from your web browsing, from the cookies that you left behind, that could determine aspects of your private views of your lifestyle. And you want the company that's hiring you to be deciding on things like that, or people are going to start modifying the way they behave in the world simply because they're afraid of how they're being monitored.
Yeah, I know people do. I know a lot of people who seem to be very hesitant, even talk on the phone. I mean, I remember mentioning marijuana once. This was 30 years ago. And I think she and I had smoked marijuana once. And boy, she went into a panic because I was talking about having smoked marijuana with her. And
well, if you want to cross the border into the U.S. and
it was in the U.S.
Yeah, and well, this could be a factor for Canadians who want to go into the United States. If they ask you if you've ever smoked marijuana, they can ban you from ever entering.
Well, all right, if you say so. I don't care. I mean, I just really wouldn't care. I guess do you know Bill Epstein?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, because one time he and I were having lunch at the UN in the cafeteria. It's a great big room, And I looked around, I said, I bet there are a whole lot of spies in this room. And he said, well, yeah, he said, and that's a good thing. He said, spying is very good. He said, it's much better for people to know what other people are really thinking and doing than just to be guessing. So spies have a very important place to play in the world.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. There are lots of things that spies do that are not to be admired. Let's say, but there's
like jabbing people with umbrellas that poison them or something.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, blackmailing people, murdering them. Yeah. One thing about the signals intelligence world is they're not so much into that side of things, which is something I appreciate. But no, it's very true that this is not a all black and white issue. That in fact, intelligence agencies gather a lot of important information. And this is when I first started studying CSE in the 1980s. This was one of the things I was most interested in, was what kind of role did it play in the global stability and the arms race, and because the intelligence agencies were in some ways what underlay the feasibility of arms control at the time, because there was very little on-site inspection allowed under the early agreements. It was about what they called national technical means, which was in effect the spy agencies would prove that you were obeying the arms control agreements. And it was also their understanding of where these weapons were and the mobilization state of forces and so on that underpinned our understanding that in fact they were not about to attack at this particular moment and so forth. You could have a crisis situation blowing up, excuse me, but at the same time you could see that neither side was mobilizing its forces, and that therefore there really wasn't a situation that was moving towards war at the time. So it was, these agencies that on one level were facilitating the arms race and facilitating conflict between the two blocks, but at the same time they were also providing stabilizing information. It was never a simple question of this is good or bad. And Canada's agency in particular was focused very much on the Northern Soviet Union, on things like what were the Soviet bomber forces up to and what were the Soviet air defenses up to.
Mm-hmm.
And this again was in many ways stabilizing kind of information to know, to be able to see that when the Soviet bombers were moving around, that these were training flights, and there was only a couple of them, and the rest of them were all dispersed in their normal bases and that kind of thing.
Well, that you make it sound as if that was a period when it was very important, but less so now. Is that true? Are there? I guess some of the treaties have surveillance or inspection routines written into them, and so on. Is it less important now to use national technical means of verification, or is it still a major factor?
I would say it's less important now, but it's still there. And of course, the danger we have right now is that most of the formal arms control that we've had from the Cold War period is gradually being torn up and eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a whole lot left at the moment. The APM treaty is gone. The Conventional Forces in Europe treaty is essentially gone. The INF treaty has been torn up. The Open Skies Treaty has just been more or less destroyed.
Now, by the way, do you understand why Biden was the one who said he wasn't going to rejoin it? He's rejoining everything else he can see. So what's special about the Open Skies Treaty that makes it problematic for him?
I don't know that. I don't know. It could be a case of there are behind the scenes discussions with the Russians about rejoining it, and they don't want to tip their hands in public. There's always in these kinds of negotiations, neither side wants to appear too keen to get what they're seeking, right? They always want to say, well, we don't really need this, so we'll agree to it if we have to. And that's all kind of negotiating strategy. So it could be that there's discussions about resuming it, but I don't know.
Well, they said they're not going to. If that's the end of the matter. And I thought, well, actually, I would have thought that the Open Skies Treaty would be the most redundant of all, because you've got satellites that find everything they want to know. So what is there to fear about having an airplane fly over?
Yeah, it is for and that's maybe one reason the US doesn't care much about it. They have their satellite systems. It's the Open Skies Treaty is participated in by, I think it's something like 35 countries, and a lot of those don't have their independent ability to collect information. So it's useful as a confidence building measure, but in terms of adding to the data that the intelligence agencies have, I don't think it's actually a major contributor that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know they can. I'm curious about how good the satellites are. And how much difference there is between the satellite data that you can access and that the best they have. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I read someplace that they could read the license plates numbers on cars from satellite data.
Yeah, I don't believe that's true.
You don't think so? Okay.
No, but
Because-
they are very high quality. Well, some of the ones have been made public, some of the images from the US systems. And you can see they're very high quality, but not quite to that level.
Mhm.
There are limits to what you can resolve through the atmosphere because of
Mhm.
distortions and I don't know, optical laws and what have you.
Mhm.
This is not my field of specialty because now you're getting into imagery and other aspects of intelligence gathering, and I'm very much focused on the signals intelligence.
Yeah, except I just read one little thing from your blog, which was cute, that
Yeah.
you were estimating how many people, how they shifted their workforce around it in response to the COVID lockdown by
Yeah.
looking at the parking lots. And so we're looking at satellite data from the parking lots. So you must have access to publicly accessible data, which must not be nearly as good as the classified satellite data, right?
Oh yeah, and particularly the imagery I was looking at there is well below the limits of even what you can get commercially.
Oh,
But the advantage was it's free imagery, so
yeah.
it's not quite
Okay.
as good. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what would you do with that information? Who cares how much they have told their staff
Yeah.
not to come to work on certain days because of COVID, et cetera? What kind of value would that information be to anybody? Or is it just your hobby? You like to do it?
Primarily, it's my hobby. I'm interested in these agencies and what they're doing. And yeah, I spend a lot of time on that. And so one way I justify spending that amount of time to myself is I do try to play a bit of an educational role about the agencies, figuring that maybe other people can understand them a bit better and then may draw other conclusions in other ways that may be useful to understand the role these agencies play in our society, or questions around privacy, or questions about what they should be doing in the cyber dimension right now. Because signals intelligence has changed dramatically from the time I first started looking at it, when it was principally about government radio signals going back and forth and being intercepted. And this was all before the internet. And that's fundamentally changed the way signals intelligence agencies work, the arrival of the internet. And now they're principally looking at communications that are traveling back and forth on the internet between governments, but also between individuals, and or even hacking into computers and just drawing the information right off those computer systems. That's what these agencies do now. And I think it's useful for people in the public to better understand these agencies so that we know the kinds of things that we should be looking for when we say what is appropriate for them to do, what's not appropriate, what sort of protections should Canadian citizens or other people in Canada have when those agencies are working, and that kind of question. I don't have the answers to all those issues, but I think better understanding of what they do is useful. They're getting better at releasing information on stuff like that somewhat, but it's still scattered in tiny little places. You can get a little bit in this accessed information document over here. You can find a little bit in this web document over here. They're tiny little things. And what I do is I put all that information together, and you draw a little more understanding from the combining of that information. So if there's any value to what I do other than for my own interest, it's probably in the fact that I can help combine some of the information that's available so that people can better understand these agencies.
Well, okay, you work with Citizens Lab, or I wonder, Citizens Lab is a really secret kind of place. I guess it is, in that, I'm a faculty member, retired faculty member, U of T, and in that building, I get in the elevator and I push, is it the third floor? I've forgotten, but it won't stop because I'm not entitled to get off on the floor that the Citizens Lab occupies.
Well,
And I guess you have to have a key, or I don't know.
you get invited in. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you why. No, the Citizen Lab, I'm a research fellow of, yes. Mostly the kind of work they do is not what I do, and so I can't speak in great detail to that. But what they're looking at is often the way governments and other bodies violate human rights in cyberspace. And so they're analyzing things like government programs to surveil dissidents and so on, or they're looking at particular apps that have been modified in order to spy on people. And that's sensitive work that they're doing, because those governments or those private companies that are involved in that business are going to start targeting the Citizen Lab to find out what they're up to, maybe to try and stop them. And so, yeah, the offices they have are high security. They don't let just anyone in there. They invite you in when you have something to talk to them, and so forth. And they need to have that kind of security, because in many cases, people's lives are actually at stake. Some of those dissidents get arrested, they get murdered.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they take security very seriously there, but in the name of protecting people.
Yeah, okay. I'm not complaining about that, because I really admire what they're doing. As a matter of fact, we did an article in Peace Magazine about it once, about 15 years ago. I don't know whether they still have this gadget or whatever you call it, but somebody there had invented a system to enable people in China or other places that were behind these I don't know, firewalls or whatever you call these things. They're not allowed to access or communicate in certain ways with people outside. And there was an arrangement whereby I could team up with somebody in, let's say, China, who wanted to be able to do things more freely, and they could use my email address or something, and we would be a partner, and I would donate this to them so they could actually get access to whatever they wanted. I'm no doubt totally misrepresenting what this thing is, but it was a very kind thing to do, to invent something that would free up people in other countries that wouldn't have been free to use the internet the way they wanted. I don't know whether that is still needed or useful or still works, or whether the Chinese have figured out a way to mess it up. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know specifically. No, I don't. Yeah.
Well, I thought that was great, because although I'm not afraid of having anybody violate my privacy, I can see why somebody, there are a lot of countries where it wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then I just wonder about, you say that the intelligence agencies are really looking at more like the cyber warfare issues, right? That sabotage of other countries' grids or whatever. I think we have to really worry about the prospects of, I don't think the next war is going to be a nuclear war. I think it's going to be a cyber war. I think they're going to turn off the tap so we don't get any water and, just wait to see what we do or something.
Well, I think that's a serious threat. Yeah, it's an area that we do need to take much more seriously. Cyber conflict could manifest in all kinds of ways, from very high level, try to shut everything down, to minor things that are basically like ransomware that we're already seeing that gets implemented for political reasons, to the whole spectrum that can or in terms of an adjunct to normal conventional warfare and so forth. But it's a very serious threat. I think we're very vulnerable to it. And it's another role that these agencies have is protection against these things. CSE, the Canadian agency, has a two-part, well, 3-4-part mandate if you want to get technical, but another part of its mandate is cybersecurity of the Canadian government and of what they call infrastructures of importance to the Canadian government, which could include critical infrastructures in Canada and so on. It's their job to help ensure those things, but I think we've got a long, long way to go in that, in this country and around the world, to protect ourselves from those kinds of perils. I think we're very vulnerable to that.
Well, my impression is that in cyber attacks or risks, that defense is a whole lot harder than offense. That anybody who wants to be a hacker, it's not all that hard to find a way to do something. And it's a whole lot harder to find a way to catch them before they do it or to keep them from doing it a second time, et cetera. That this, and therefore, you know, if that is forever the case, what do you do about it? I mean, I think decentralization and going back to the Stone Age is the only answer.
Well, I think that I won't go to the Stone Age, but decentralization, I think, is an important part of it. What gets sometimes ignored in discussions of defense and offense is the idea of resilience, which is having your systems set up so that they fail gracefully, so that one part doesn't pull another part down, and that other parts operate independently of each other. They have backups so that they can recover quickly, so that systems can be brought on and so forth. That you avoid single points of failure and so on. So decentralization is one part of that, where there isn't a single, you take it down in one spot and everything goes down. And I think
the trend is very much more towards centralization, right?
Somewhat, yeah, but not entirely. I think the idea of resilience is certainly out there in the cybersecurity world, but I think it's something we need to pay much more attention to, and greater focus on cybersecurity. And this is one of the interesting questions that comes up when you look at an agency like CSEs, because they've got roles that in some ways contradict each other. They have a role which is to collect signals intelligence, which means they want systems to be vulnerable to being able to be broken into. And they have a role now, since the passage of C-59 in 2019, they have a cyber attack role too.
Sorry, what is C-59?
C-59 was, well, it was Bill C-59. I think it was it modified, it was called the National Security Act, I think it's 2019 when it was passed. But it contained a number of things, including the Communications Security Establishment Act, which created a whole new act related to CSE. And in that act was the addition of powers to do cyber attack. We don't know exactly where Canada's going with that. They're very, very secretive about that. And it's likely that we're dipping our toes in those waters very, very carefully. But the argument, I suppose, on one level is you can't bring nothing to a cyber fight. You know,
Yeah.
There's a deterrence argument. Now, I don't think deterrence applies that well in the cyber world.
Does it?
Partly because there's a huge attribution problem.
Yeah.
In terms of, do you know who did it, and do you know it was done intentionally? And even if it came through Russia, do you know the Russian government did it, or even Russians did it? Because when we do something in another country, we may be doing it through computers in Kenya or something like that, that we are using as the base of our operations. And if it's a huge operation, you may well know who did it, but if it's minor gray area stuff that doesn't necessarily cross the threshold, you can't deter that stuff by saying, I'm going to strike back, or it's very problematic. So it's an interesting and rough area, and one that I think we need to talk about publicly. And it's not helpful really that our agencies are so secretive about what they think is appropriate norms in cyberspace and what's appropriate conduct and so forth.
Yeah,
And
Paul Meyer has long been
yes,
involved in this work on I think there's an open-ended working group on trying to get some sort of regulation or treaty or something about cyber
cyber
infrastructure
norms. Yeah.
rules and so on. But there's another outfit besides the open-ended working group. They're sort of working in parallel or similar issues. I think he's been involved in that. And certainly but as I understand it, they've been proposing, and in fact, it was the Russians who took the lead, I think, in proposing it several years ago, some sort of international convention or something. Uh, I don't know. I don't think the word was that it was really mostly the US that didn't want to get involved with any restrictions on their capacity because they had the advantage at that point. Maybe now with this colonial pipeline thing and this meat packing or whatever it was, where they're now having big, sabotage efforts in the US, maybe they're giving it another thought.
My sense, is that these are really important discussions around norms, but we're not going to get binding agreements that are enforceable in a field like this. It's just too difficult to prove what everybody's up to. It's like espionage, and the techniques are in the cyber world are almost identical. It's really just a question of what you do with these techniques.
Mhm.
And so yeah, these are vital discussions, and to try to come to kinds of tacit agreements on how you behave, I think is possible and important. And there are those kinds of tacit agreements somewhat, even in the espionage world, about we're not going to murder each other's agents and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't see that we're ever going to get binding agreements that control it because it's just too difficult. But so for my sense, it's much more important to put a lot more effort into the cyber defense side of it, difficult as it is, and the resilience side of it, which recognizes sometimes there are going to be problems. Things are going to collapse either because of intentional attacks or software failings of some kind. We need to be able to recover from those things. We need systems that are designed to recover even when they're under attack. Those are the things I think we need to focus on. And it's an interesting question now because for our cyber policies, because we have an agency that has missions in all three of those areas. And so how is it supposed to balance these things? It has an agency which is steal secrets from cyber systems. We have an agency that is attack cyber systems, and we have an agency that is defend cyber systems. And
they're not all in the same team.
Yeah, well, and it's very useful for them to know how it's done for each of those elements to know. But at the same time, the whole world operates with essentially the same cyber systems these days. It's not like the Russians have a different system than we have. And so the software is all more or less identical, and the hardware is all more or less identical. And so if we know of a vulnerability in the hardware and software that applies to us or that applies to them, it also applies to us. And so if we're hiding vulnerabilities so we can use them against them, we are probably leaving those vulnerabilities open so they can be used against us. So it's a really tough area. And I think a really interesting one. I don't have all the answers to it, but I think it's something we need a more open and high level discussion on than to leave it in the hands of an agency that won't talk to anybody about anything to decide these things. And I shouldn't say it's entirely in the hands of CSE to do that, because in particular in cyber attack issues, there's a process in the law which brings in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and in particular the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has to sign off on these things, as well as the Minister of National Defense. So there's a slight recognition you have to build that out from the spy agency itself, but it's still a very closed circle within government and within a very limited part of government. So it's an interesting field. I think this is one of the areas where it'd be useful if people know more about what the Canadian government is up to, what other governments are up to, and what's at stake here.
Well, that brings me back to your work. I mean, what can you and do you maybe contribute to this awareness that we need? I don't, maybe I need some awareness that I'm not aware that I need. I don't know what a good citizen should be conscious of that we are not sufficiently conscious of in order to be worried about what the government is doing or should be doing and isn't doing. Are you finding out that kind of thing? Do you have some advice for folks like Adam and me?
Yeah, I there's not anything I say on these issues that's unique to anything I've learned. What the Citizen Lab has said on these things, or what someone like Stephanie Carvin will tell you. She's a professor at Carleton University who talks about security and intelligence issues a lot. Or there's a book that just came out that's sort of an introduction to the Canadian security and intelligence community. University of Toronto Press published, which is a good introduction for people who are just looking to learn more about the community. I do have a conflict of interest in plugging it because I wrote the chapter on CSE for this book.
Okay.
It's called Top Secret Canada.
Okay, show it to us and I'll get it. I'll hold it. Wait a minute. Let's see if I can get a good Top Secret Canada, Understanding the Canadian Intelligence and National Security Community. Hold it a little higher. Edited by Stephanie Carvin, Thomas Juneau, and Craig Forsese. Craig Forsese, sociologist, isn't he? Yeah. Okay, I don't know the English, but okay.
Well, Craig Forsese now is I think the acting chair of the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, but he got that position after that book was edited. So he's in a very key position in the review agency that looks after or oversees, reviews technically, if you want to use the technical language, reviews the Canadian security and intelligence community. That's a very new agency, which was also created by that 2019 Act, Bill C-59. So it's just starting to get its feet and take up its role. But I think it's going to be very interesting to watch that, because I think it could play a key role in looking at these issues for Canadians and providing information to Canadians about what's going on.
Now, what's the name of the outfit now?
National Security and Intelligence Review Agency.
And that is a separate thing from the CSE that you specialize in.
Oh yeah. This is a review agency that is meant to look at the activities of CSE and CSIS and other parts of the Canadian intelligence community, and review whether it's appropriate, legal, whether it's a good idea or what they're doing, that kind of thing, and also to be able to look at cross-cutting issues that go across the entire Canadian security and intelligence community. So it replaced the review agency that used to look at CSIS, which was called CERC. And it also replaced the agency that used to look at CSE, which was called the CSE Commissioner. And it also now looks at all these other elements of the community, which is an entirely new aspect of its mandate.
Well, now, how do they handle secrecy themselves? Do they have access to everything they want to look at, or are there things that they can't have access to?
They have very, very good access. They don't have access to cabinet documents. They can, other than that, they can demand anything that's in the control of one of these agencies. Now their reports are subject to redaction for security purposes. So they can't report everything that they see. They can talk about everything they see in general terms. So, for example, If they saw something that they felt was illegal, they could say this program X is illegal. They might not be able to specify this program X, which does A, B, and C specifically, is illegal in our view. That they could talk in general terms about it, and they could tell the public that there's a problem here. So
Mm,
the fact that they're subject to redaction is it's inevitable, because there are secrets that Canada needs to keep, and they know that, and they wouldn't try to reveal them all in these public documents. It's also it's unfortunate, and maybe there's too much redaction, and they push against that. They will try where they feel it didn't have to be redacted, and that'll be a continuing area of struggle with the agencies about whether it has to be redacted or not. But the major assurance role that they provide can be provided despite the fact of those redactions. I don't think we need to worry about that. So it's
give me
yeah.
another a summary of the structure of the thing. These different outfits, sounds like there are a whole bunch of different separate groups. That doesn't make sense to me. I knew of CSIS, which I believed was just the only outfit that was supposed to look at Canadians, specialize in finding out which Canadians were doing bad things or whatever. So it's spying on Canadians. Then there's CSE, which is the Canadian agency to spy on the rest of the world, right? And then now you've got, and you specialize in that. Now you've got these, you talk about different groups, some dealing with defense and some offense and something else. And then there's this review thing. So there's a lot of boxes there for you to put labels on, please.
There are, and that book would be useful that way. Okay, well, CSE, the Communications Security Establishment, does foreign intelligence primarily. It's the Signals Intelligence Agency that spies on communications and computers. It has two major roles, which is spying on foreign computers and communications, and protecting Canadian communications and computers of the government of Canada and so on. It also has this new cyber attack role, which is also directed only outside of Canada. And it also has a role to support Canadian law enforcement and federal government law enforcement security agencies. So that means that if CSIS needs some sort of spying that CSE is capable of doing, CSE can do that on the basis of a CSIS authority. That's all complicated, but the details are in the books, if you will. CSIS, as you say, is for spying principally within Canada, but it's a security intelligence agency, so its major role is protection of the security of Canada, and because of that, it can actually spy outside of Canada too, but only on issues related to the security of Canada. So, yeah, that's complex. And it's outside of my particular area, but they do have spies working outside of Canada on things like anti-terrorism, for terrorist threats to Canada, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
but they do so they do human intelligence basically, which is working person-to-person spies and wiretapping.
Yeah.
And then there's the RCMP does criminal intelligence for Canada, and the National Defense has its own intelligence apparatus. And so there's a broader Canadian intelligence community that is coordinated through the Privy Council office, all these different agencies. And then we have this independent review agency, which is supposed to examine all these things for legality and appropriate conduct, and even the things like efficiency, proportionality, which is supposed to report effectively to the public and to Parliament.
Have they done it?
And that's Well, and this is in particular, the agency, which is brand new. They've had, I think, just one annual report out at this point. And they're just starting up. They're really still staffing up to do all these things, hiring the people. And they had to do this in the middle of COVID-19 arriving, which makes it hard to do even normal day-to-day operations. But on top of that, most of the work these agencies like that can do involves such secret information that you can't work from home on it. You have to work in the office in special secure offices. So a lot of that work had to be postponed or at least slowed down when COVID-19 was really hitting, because they couldn't work in those offices. You just can't have the people going into them, at least in those numbers. They had to, and this affected NCIRA, the review agency in particular too. So to cut them some slack, yeah, they're just starting up. And so there's not a lot of output yet. But we're really expecting that to start to arrive pretty soon. And so that's going to be very interesting to see in practice how that actually works out to be.
Well, do they have any rules designed for protection of civil liberties? There are rules about you're supposed to get a warrant to break into somebody's home to, things like that. Do they have any safeguards for that kind of thing?
Yeah. Now, when you want to spy on a Canadian, this is all done by judicial warrants. If you've got a particular named target, now this is done by CSIS or the RCMP. They go to a judge, they get a warrant, and so on. That CSE, as I say, is targets foreigners outside of Canada. They don't get judicial warrants for that. They do have a warrant process that's called a ministerial authorization. That since Bill C-59 in 2019 has had a quasi-judicial oversight process added to that too. So it's something called the Intelligence Commissioner, who oversees that and only approves those authorizations if they meet a certain reasonability standard that's laid out in the law. It's not a judicial process, but it's quasi-judicial, and the person occupying that office is a retired judge. And then those decisions are also overseen by the NCIRA, this review agencies, who can look at that and also second guess them potentially. So there is oversight for that. Now, if CSE gets called on to help monitor a Canadian abroad for, say, CSIS, that can only be done if CSIS has a particular judicial warrant to monitor that Canadian from a judge. And then CSIS takes that warrant to CSE and says, we have this warrant for Canadian, do your stuff. So yeah, there are processes to control that, legally speaking. And beyond that, there are also privacy rules about what to do with information that gets collected that involves Canadians that may or may not have the status of laws, and there are questions of where the Canadian Charter of Rights fits in and so on. It gets complicated even for the lawyers, well beyond me to judge. But yeah, there are definitely processes that look at all these things.
And what about protecting people in other countries? Either Canadians say, if I were to spend a year in Russia and I was writing stuff that Putin wouldn't like, which would be very likely, there's certain kind of vulnerability for Canadian living in countries, as we know with these two Michaels in China, for example, somebody can come along and throw you in jail. Are there procedures for identifying vulnerable Canadians in other countries and keeping track of their well-being? And if they do it for Canadians, do they do it for friendly foreigners that we treasure, dissident people who are helping in some way or another?
Yeah, well, that's an area where there's not a lot of information. Even within Canada, targets of foreign intelligence agencies do sometimes get warnings from CSIS or indirectly from CSE that they're being targeted. Um, Usually, I think, in ways that protect Canadian sources of intelligence. Obviously, they don't want to reveal how they know this information necessarily, but there are some of this does go on. We're told there are not a lot of good public examples, known examples of it happening, but yes. So Canadians who are targeted by foreign agencies may get some warning, tip off of it from Canadian agencies. There won't be necessarily a lot of assistance. Now under the 2019 law, infrastructures of importance to the government of Canada, which could be more like vulnerable companies working, say, in healthcare or communications or the electrical infrastructure, could get actual assistance in developing their own defenses against these things, as not just being warned that they are under attack at a moment, but assistance in that way. So they're just starting up to be more active in that. And again, they're very secretive about who's getting this kind of help, but they could probably go a lot further in that kind of assistance. Potentially, though, it is done to some extent, yeah.
What if, take the case of the Huawei situation, where many countries, including Canada, have been making decisions about whether to allow Huawei equipment to be part of the cyber infrastructure in Canada for this 5G thing.
Yeah.
Now, what organizations would be making judgments about that, or trying to collect the relevant information about it? Would be CSE?
Yeah, they'd be one of them. CSIS also, for sure. You know, I think CSE's argument on Huawei has been that you have to build safeguards and resilience and multiple protections against failures into such systems, regardless of who provides them. Because even in the case of friendly companies, the companies from friendly countries, the supply systems are so interrelated around the world. You don't know where all the components have come from, and software mistakes get exploited that even the company may not be aware of, and so on. So these systems may be vulnerable to exploitation, regardless of whether the company is involved in that or not. So it's a broader question than just say Huawei or go with one of the other providers. But having said that, I think there is a serious issue with, say, a company like Huawei when it comes to not so much the listening in question, but the cyber attack sort of question, where if we got into a broader dispute with China, could our entire communications infrastructure be shut down one day by instructions from Beijing to, it's like, oh, we'll just turn them off for a day. And we don't want to be in a position where we're ever vulnerable to that kind of thing. So these are certainly serious questions to look at, and I think ones where we are going to have to be more serious about the supply chain of critical systems that our societies run on now.
Do you know whether the Canadian government is in the trade for looking for what they call 0 days? There's a book. I'm going to be interviewing a woman named Nicole Perlroth. She was supposed to have done already, but we put it off. She has a book about the trade in the worldwide market for 0 days, finding vulnerabilities in various kinds of systems, and then buying and selling them. Now, she was saying that the US, I think, does buy this from, petty crooks, or they're not so petty, but they're, skilled hackers. is that, you know, whether goes out and says, tell me, we'll buy your discoveries?
Well, it's an area where they're very secretive, but we do, to the best of my knowledge, we do deals with companies that supply those kinds of things that themselves buy 0 days and sell them to
Mhm,
intelligence agencies. There are some companies out there that claim and maybe do restrict their customers to the Five Eyes agencies.
mhm,
And I know we work with those. CSE has a process which they've described in general terms publicly, although they don't talk about how it works in practice, to decide how to deal with that kind of information when they have it. Because, as I say, there's a trade-off between deciding whether to take that information to the software manufacturer and get them to close the vulnerability, which you would want to do for cyber defense purposes or cybersecurity in general, or do you use that vulnerability for your own cyber attack or cyber espionage purposes? And there's a process they have to
mhm,
measure those different
mhm,
equities, those claims the different sides of the agency have, and to consider whether your allies are using that vulnerability already and so on. They don't talk in detailed terms about how that actually works, just in a very general
mhm.
box description of that. So yeah, we're in that business. We deal with that question, and it's a critical one, I think.
Okay. Well, this has been fun. Time's up, and I've enjoyed it. I don't know whether I'm going to sleep any easier tonight because of it, but but I'm glad to know that if anybody's doing this kind of work, that it's you. Okay.
Well, I enjoy doing it.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Nice
Take
talking to you.
care.